The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $80, and Del Hutchins laughed so hard he had to slap his own knee to keep from spilling his coffee. It was the kind of laugh that filled the whole gravel lot behind the Miller barn, a laugh built to be heard, and every head in the crowd turned to see what was so funny. What was funny, according to Del, was that a small, quiet woman in a canvas jacket had just paid $80 for a welded milk crate. Not a milk crate full of tools, not a milk crate with a story, just a rusted steel milk crate with its top plate welded shut in 4 clumsy beads, sitting on the auction table like a brick nobody wanted to move. It was the 9th of April, 1986, at the Miller Estate auction, 3 miles north of Beacon Hollow, in the sort of small Ohio farm town where a person could still buy a pie at the feed store on a Saturday morning and know the woman who baked it. The Miller place had gone under 2 winters back, and the family had picked at the bones of the property for a year before letting the auction house finish the job. There were tractors out front, and a good hay rake, and a set of walnut chairs a Columbus dealer had already circled twice. Nobody had circled the welded milk crate. The auctioneer had almost skipped it. He had held it up, made a joke about scrap value, and started the bidding at $5 just to move the thing along. And the small woman in the canvas jacket had raised her hand. Her name was Ruth Ann Kessler, and she was 68 years old that spring. She was lean the way a fence post is lean, stooped a little at the shoulders from 41 years of leaning over a workbench, and her face was lined the way a creek bank is lined, in patient washes that told you what the weather had been. She wore a soft work cap the color of oatmeal, a chambray shirt buttoned to the second button, and a canvas jacket with a burn hole on the right cuff from a stray bead of slag. Her hands were the thing you noticed if you knew what to look for. They were scarred across the knuckles and shiny across the palms, and the pads of her thumbs were flat from a life spent pressing metal against metal. Ruth Ann was a welder. She had learned the trade in her father's shop on the edge of Beacon Hollow in 1938, and she had kept the shop open, alone, from the day her father died in 1962 until the morning of this auction. Del Hutchins, who was still laughing, was 49, ruddy, clean-shaven, and heavy through the middle in the way of a man who ate lunch at a desk. He wore a bright red sport coat over a company polo that read Hutchins Realty and Land, and a gold ring on his little finger that caught the sun every time he lifted his cup. His truck was parked at the front of the lot, a white late model with dealer plates still in the window, and it sat there gleaming like a tooth next to Ruth Ann's dented brown pickup with the tailgate wired shut. Del had come to the auction for the walnut chairs and the hay rake, and he had stayed, he said, for the entertainment. $80, Del said again, loud enough for the back row. $80 for a tin can. Ruth Ann, honey, if you needed a paperweight, I'd have given you one. A few men laughed with him, because Del was the sort of man other men laughed with, even when they did not want to. Ruth Ann did not turn her head. She walked up to the auction table, paid the clerk in 4 $20 bills folded once down the middle, and put her hand flat on the top of the welded milk crate, the way another woman might put her hand on the head of a child. She felt the beads with her thumb. She felt the weight of the thing as she tipped it toward her, and she felt, though she did not say so, the small strange fact that had made her raise her hand in the first place, which was that the welds on the top plate had been laid by somebody who knew what he was doing, and the crate itself was heavier than a welded milk crate ought to be. Del called after her as she carried it to her truck. He called the thing the lunchbox, and by the end of the afternoon, half the men at the auction were calling it the lunchbox, and by the following Tuesday, the whole town of Beacon Hollow was calling it the lunchbox, and the story of the $80 lunchbox was the funniest thing anyone had heard in a hard year. Ruth Ann did not answer. She set the crate in the bed of her truck, laid an old horse blanket over it out of habit, and drove home slow along the county road, with her elbow out the window and the April wind cool on her wrist. She had learned the trade from her father, Emil Kessler, who had come to Ohio from a small town outside Stuttgart in 1921, with a stick welder and a set of files, and a saying he repeated so often that Ruth Ann had it in her bones before she was tall enough to see over his bench. "A weld," he would tell her, "is a man's handwriting in steel. You can lie with your mouth and you can lie with your eyes, but you cannot lie with a weld, because the metal remembers everything you did to it and everything you were thinking while you did it." Her father had taught her to read welds the way other people read letters, and by the time she was 15, she could look at a bead and tell you whether the man who laid it had been tired or angry, or in a hurry, or in love. When she looked at the 4 beads on the top of the welded milk crate at the Miller auction, she had seen something that stopped her. The beads were careful. They were slow. They were laid by a man who had all the time in the world and no reason to hurry, and that, in Ruth Ann's experience, meant the man had known he was sealing something he did not want opened by anyone in a rush. She drove home to the shop on Kessler Road, which was her road because her grandfather had cut the first ditch along it in 1924, and she parked the truck beside the sliding barn door and sat for a minute with her hands on the wheel. The dogwood by the mailbox was just beginning to bud. The shop smelled, when she opened the door, of old cutting oil and cold iron, and the faint sweetness of the coffee she had left on the burner that morning. She carried the welded milk crate in both arms across the concrete floor, set it on the center bench under the shop light, and looked at it for a long time before she did anything else. The crate was standard dairy issue, the kind that used to hold 12 glass quart bottles at the Miller Dairy before the dairy closed in 1971. The wire sides had been reinforced from inside with sheet steel, so that what looked like a crate was really a small box with the appearance of a crate. The top was a plate of 1/4-inch steel welded down along all 4 edges, and the welds, up close, were even better than she had thought at the auction. They were the kind of welds a man laid when he did not want water to get in, or air, or time. On the underside of the crate, scratched into the sheet steel with the point of a nail, were 3 letters and a year, EM and 1968. Ruth Ann sat down on her stool and put her hand over her mouth. Everett Miller had died in the fall of 1968. He had been the middle son of the Miller family that owned the dairy and the 200 acres north of Beacon Hollow, and he had been Ruth Ann's friend, though not more than that, from the summer they were both 9 years old. Everett had been a quiet man. He had run the dairy books after his father got sick, and in the last year of his life, the dairy had lost a great deal of money, and the story that went around town, at the time, was that Everett had taken it. Cash out of the accounts, a cousin's inheritance out of the safe, a signed loan that came due after his death and nearly ruined his mother. The story had come out of the mouth of Everett's business partner, a man named Carl Bricker, who had cried at the funeral and taken over the dairy books the following Monday and sold the dairy, eventually, to a company out of Toledo for a price nobody was ever allowed to see. Everett had been found in his car at the bottom of the quarry road 3 days before the audit was to be finished. The sheriff had called it an accident. The town had called it something else, quietly, over coffee, for 18 years. Ruth Ann had never believed any of it. She had not said so at the time, because a woman who ran a welding shop alone in 1968 did not spend her opinions cheaply. But she had not believed it, and she had never stopped not believing it. And now she was sitting on a stool in her shop looking at 4 careful welds that Everett Miller had laid in the last weeks of his life, on the top of a milk crate from his own family's dairy. The word of the $80 lunchbox got to the Beacon Hollow diner by Tuesday breakfast. By Thursday it had made it to the feed store, and by Saturday morning Del Hutchins was telling the story at the counter of the hardware store with his coffee cup in one hand and a rolled-up plat map in the other. He told it well. Del told everything well. He described Ruth Ann handing over her 420s as if she had been handing over a child, and he did an imitation of her walking to the truck with the crate that made the men at the counter laugh into their sleeves. A younger man named Perry Loomis, who worked part-time in Ruth Ann's shop on Saturdays, and who was quiet in the way she was quiet, heard the story and did not laugh. He drove out to the shop that afternoon and found Ruth Ann standing at the bench with a cup of cold coffee and a magnifier and the welded milk crate in front of her. "They're saying you got taken," Perry said. "I know what they're saying," Ruth Ann said. "You didn't get taken." "No," she said. "I didn't." Perry looked at the crate. He was 22 years old, and he had been working Saturdays in the shop for 3 years, and he had learned to keep his mouth shut when Ruth Ann was reading a bead. He looked at the 4 welds on the top plate for a long time. "Those are Everett Miller's," he said finally, because Ruth Ann had taught him how to read them, and he had learned. "Yes," Ruth Ann said. "They are." She did not open it that night. She did not open it the next night either. She spent 4 evenings looking at it, and turning it, and running the pad of her thumb along each of the 4 beads, because her father had told her once that a weld is a promise, and a person opening a promise ought to know what the promise was for before they broke it. On the 5th evening, she set up the cut. She did not use a torch. A torch would have burned whatever was inside. She used a small hand grinder with a fresh cutting wheel, and she used it slow, and she used it in short passes, letting the steel cool between them, feeling the plate with the flat of her palm the way a doctor feels a forehead. It took her most of a night to cut the first bead. It took her the next night to cut the second. On the 3rd night, Perry came out and sat on the stool by the door without speaking and watched her work the 3rd. On the 4th night, she cut the last, and when the plate finally lifted, the sound the crate made was exactly the sound her father used to describe when he talked about a good seal giving way at last. It was, he had said, the sound of a held breath finally letting go. Ruth Ann did not look inside right away. She set the cutting wheel down. She wiped her hands on a rag. She stood up straight, and she looked at the ceiling of the shop for a moment, and then she looked at Perry, and then she looked into the crate. Inside, wrapped in oiled brown paper the color of a paper grocery sack, were 3 things. The first was a ledger, small and black, the kind a bookkeeper carried in his coat pocket. The second was a canvas bank pouch, heavy, tied at the neck with a piece of baling twine. The third was an envelope, sealed with wax, addressed in a careful hand to whoever opens this. Ruth Ann took the envelope out first. She sat down on her stool, and Perry sat down on his, and she broke the wax with her thumbnail and unfolded the 2 pages inside. The letter was dated the 12th of September, 1968. To whoever opens this, the letter began, "My name is Everett Miller, and if you are reading these words, then I am no longer able to speak them. I am writing this on the evening of the 11th, and tomorrow morning I will drive to the county seat to give the auditor the ledger you now hold. If I return, I will unseal this crate myself, and none of what follows will matter. If I do not return, then I need you to understand 3 things. First, I did not take a single dollar from the Miller Dairy. Second, my partner, Carl Bricker, took $41,260 over the course of 17 months, and the ledger in your hands records every entry in his own hand, because he kept a second book and did not know that I had found it. Third, the pouch beside this letter contains $11,400 in cash, which is the money I was able to recover before he understood I knew. It belongs to my mother, Alma Miller, and to my cousin, Frances Miller Doyle, in equal shares. I am sealing it here because I do not trust a bank in this county, and I do not trust a safe in this house, and I know that if I am wrong about what will happen tomorrow, then someone patient and honest will find this eventually, and I will trust that person, because I have to trust someone. Please do not keep it. Please carry it where it needs to go. My mother is a good woman, and she's been made to grieve for the wrong reason, and I would like her, if it is possible, to grieve for the right one instead. Signed, Everett Miller. Ruth Ann read the letter twice, then she folded it and put it back in the envelope, and she sat with her hands on her knees for a long time. Perry did not say anything. Outside, an owl called once from the tree by the mailbox, and then the shop was quiet again. She could have kept it. Alma Miller had been dead for 4 years. Frances Miller Doyle lived alone in a small house on the far side of Beacon Hollow, a widow now, a woman in her 70s who cleaned the church on Wednesdays for a small wage and did not ask anyone for anything. The $11,400 in the pouch in Ruth Ann's shop on a Thursday night in April of 1986 was the difference between a hard old age and a soft one. She could have kept the ledger too, or burned it, and no one in the town of Beacon Hollow would ever have known that the story they had told themselves for 18 years was the wrong story. Ruth Ann sat with that thought for perhaps a minute. Then she stood up, and she wrapped the letter and the ledger and the pouch back in the oiled brown paper, and she set them in a canvas tote she kept by the door for her Sunday groceries. "Get some sleep, Perry," she said. "I have a stop to make in the morning." She drove to Frances Miller Doyle's house at 7 in the morning. Frances opened the door in a housecoat with her hair still in a braid down her back, and Ruth Ann stood on the step with the canvas tote in her hand and said only that Everett had left something for her, and it had taken a long time to find, and she was sorry it had taken so long. She set the tote inside the door. She did not go in. Frances asked her twice to come in for coffee, and Ruth Ann said no, gently, and walked back to her truck before Frances had opened the tote, because there are some kinds of thanks a person ought not to be present for. From Frances's house she drove to the sheriff's office in the county seat, and left the ledger on the desk of a young deputy who had been in second grade the year Everett died. She told him what it was in 3 sentences. She signed a paper. She drove home. The rest of it happened without her. The ledger was read by the county prosecutor on a Monday. Carl Bricker was arrested on a Wednesday. He had moved by then into a large brick house on the east side of Beacon Hollow, and he had built up a small insurance office next to the bank, and he had been, for 18 years, one of the men Del Hutchins had lunch with on Fridays. The trial was short. The ledger, in Carl's own hand, was the sort of evidence a defense attorney could only shake his head at. Carl was sentenced in the fall of 1986 and served 6 years, and when he came out, he did not come back to Beacon Hollow. The dairy sale was reopened. Frances Miller Doyle received a settlement from the Toledo Company that had bought the dairy at a discount on the strength of the false books, and she used part of it to buy a headstone for Everett that read, simply, "Everett Miller, 1927 to 1968, a good man at last." Del Hutchins said very little through any of it. He stopped telling the lunchbox story at the hardware counter. He stopped, for a while, coming to auctions. 2 years later, his realty company failed after a land deal in the next county went sideways, and by the spring of 1989, he had sold his white truck and his brick office and moved south to Florida, where, according to a Christmas card someone at the diner read out loud once, he was selling timeshares near Fort Myers. The welded milk crate itself, with the top plate cut cleanly along 4 beads and set back in place with wire, was donated by Frances Miller Doyle to the Beacon Hollow Historical Society, which put it in a glass case in the front room of the Old Grange Hall with a small brass plaque that told the true story in 92 words. Ruth Ann was not mentioned on the plaque. She had asked, quietly, that she not be, and Frances had honored the request the way you honor a request from a person who has already given you back your family's name. Ruth Ann went to see the case once, on a Tuesday evening in June, after the Grange Hall had closed for the day. She stood on the sidewalk outside the window with her hands in the pockets of her canvas jacket and looked in at the crate under the yellow display light, and she stayed there for perhaps 2 minutes. Then she got back in her brown truck with the wired tailgate, and she drove home along the county road with her elbow out the window, and the June air was warm on her wrist, and she did not stop at the diner, and she did not turn on the radio, and when she got to the shop on Kessler Road, she made herself a fresh pot of coffee and sat on her stool at the bench and looked for a while at nothing at all. Her father had told her once, in the winter of 1953, that the whole point of a good weld was that nobody ever noticed it. A bad weld you saw first thing. A good weld disappeared into the work, and the work stood up, and the man who had laid the bead went home and ate his supper, and did not need anyone to tell him he had done it right, because the metal already knew. Ruth Ann had thought about that saying for 33 years, and she thought about it again that night, and she found that she agreed with it more than ever. So I will leave it with you. If you had been the one at that bench, on that April night in 1986, with the letter in your hand and the pouch beside it, and the whole town of Beacon Hollow still laughing at you for paying $80 for a welded milk crate, would you have carried the tote to Francis Miller Doyle's door at 7 in the morning, and the ledger to the deputy an hour after that, and told no one, ever, that any of it had passed through your hands? Or would you have kept a little of it, just a little for the trouble, and told yourself that after 18 years no one would ever know the difference?